Hey everyone, I'm Rather Coherent, and these are all of the mystics in Arkham Horror laid out with their signature cards as well as their signature weaknesses, and I'm going to go through all of them and talk about what I think makes each of them independently strong as much as I can within a vacuum. The point of this exercise is to figure out how much of a character's strength comes from their abilities and what comes with the investigator, as opposed to their stat lines and their deck building rules. I want to see just what contributes to each character's individual strength, whether it's their card pool, their stat line, or their abilities more. And the only way to really do that is to go through each and every one of those facets of each character and see how I rank them compared to what a real game would show. I've already done the other four classes. We're going to be finishing today with Mystics, and we're going to be starting with Gloria Goldberg. She gives you the ability to choose the investigator order during the Mythos phase. I actually played an entire campaign with Gloria, going through great lengths with Alyssa Graham and Scrying 3 to try to figure out exactly who gets what cards. It would have been a lot easier if I remembered that ability existed. It turns out Gloria requires a lot less work to make good than I was putting into her, and she should have been even more broken in the campaign than I played her through. Nice. Very cool. Anyways, when you look at one or more cards from the encounter deck, look at one additional card and choose one non-elite card among them. Either discard it, put it on top of the encounter deck, or place it face down beneath Gloria Goldberg, max 3 cards beneath her. Her star effect is +1, look at the top card of the encounter deck, which, because you're Gloria, means that you're going to actually look at the top 2, and you can choose one among them to discard or place under you. Now let's talk about the idea of placing them under you for a second. Your weakness is Liber Omnium Finium. It is a revelation where you draw a random non-weakness encounter card from beneath Gloria Goldberg. That card gains peril, its effects cannot be cancelled, and you get -2 to all skills while resolving its effects. If that card is an enemy, it immediately attacks you. If no card is drawn by this effect, shuffle this card back into your deck. Now the big one there is if that card is an enemy, it immediately attacks you. There are also several skill tests that you don't want to be taking at -2 with peril. So when you look at Gloria's ability, you might be tempted to put a lot of cards under her. And if you're looking at something like Ancient Evils, fine, go for it. There's no test involved. The worst that happens, the same as drawing the Ancient Evils again later because you discarded it. That's fine. You can put testless penalties under yourself. But do not, under no circumstances, put an enemy that hits for 2 meat damage under Gloria Goldberg. You'll learn your lesson real fast. Generally, the way her ability works is you just look at the top X cards of the deck, you choose who gets what, and you discard the really brutal ones. That's an absolutely insane ability. Mystic, generally speaking, can scry pretty often. They have a variety of card effects, and it's fair to say that Gloria can just scry every turn guaranteed. It's actually better than that in a real game, because Alyssa Graham just lets you do it every single turn with no penalty. You just look at the top 2 and use your ability instead of Alyssa's ability to discard one of them. It's completely nuts. I want to say more about Gloria's ability, but there's nothing else to say. She just defends the Mythos deck. You look at the top cards, you take them out if they're bad. If they're good, you give them to whoever cares the least about them. She's just absolutely crazy. She is one of the most transparently game-breaking investigators in the game, and she's one of the reasons why in a combined tier list, a lot of those Seekers aren't going to get to stay in S tier. And consequently, when they move down to A+, a lot of the A+ characters are going to get pushed down too. Because frankly, most characters aren't competing with this. And the ones that do are doing absolutely crazy stuff like the big 3 survivors are. I also might just have like an S+ tier for the absolutely game-breaking abilities. That's another choice I have. But as you might be able to tell already, without even talking about her signature card, she's gonna go in the top of my S tier. And it's good that Ruth Westmacott doesn't matter, because she's not very good. As an ally slot in Mystic, that position can be pretty competitive. Usually, if you've bought the charisma to afford her to be played, you also bought something that more deserves the ally slot than her. She's 3 cost with 2/3 soak, so it's not all bad. You very frequently play her just because you care about the soak. But the simple problem is that most of the time you're not putting cards under you. And even if you were, Ruth Westmacott's only giving someone an unexpected courage anyway when you use her ability to put it back in that discard pile. It's just not that good. She's fine. She's mostly just extra soak in case the game's going really poorly, which is always nice to have. It's better than nothing, but usually nothing would have drawn through your deck 1 card faster, and you might have been better off. Anyway, her weakness just influences how you use her ability. It doesn't actually punish you that much. So she's going at the top of S tier because as far as abilities go, the Mythos deck is just going to do what I tell it to do. Is kind of insane. It turns out the Mythos deck is how you lose Arkham Horror. It's basically the entirety of the challenge in this game. And just handing out cards as you please to people every turn and discarding the ones that are actually scary is absolutely crazy. Coming down to Jacqueline Fine, her ability is that when you would reveal any number of chaos tokens, and by you, I mean an investigator at your location, doesn't have to be you get to reveal 2 additional tokens. Then you choose and cancel 2 of them, unless there's a squid, in which case you just cancel the squid. Very, very rarely you will cancel the other 2 and keep the squid if you pulled like Elder Thing plus Cultist and would have failed and got into penalties. That's a really strong ability. It definitely gets a lot worse on higher difficulties, but I rank these characters on standard 2 to 4 player multiplayer, and on standard difficulty, this ability is absolutely insane. The star effect is +1. You can choose to ignore it instead, though, and draw a card, which is actually really, really good. I should specify, if you ignore it with a different effect, it does this. You can't just choose to ignore it anytime you get it. It is a really incredibly strong effect. The extra draw, especially in Mystic, is really appreciated from that Elder Sign effect, which you'll see more than most characters because they're revealing more tokens than most characters. And her ability is fantastic. You can use it for yourself to avoid penalties and guarantee success on your Mystic assets, or you can give it to a fighter who's taking a really important flamethrower shot. There's always a powerful, immediately relevant use for Jacqueline Fine's ability. Anyways, as long as we're talking about her in standard difficulty, where her ability is nuts, Arbiter of Fates is absolutely incredible, one of the better signature assets in the game, very easily. Her weakness is the card Dark Future. It is incredibly soft. It stops you from using your signature ability. You're still a 5-head Mystic, you're still fine. And then, at the end of the round, you reveal 5 tokens in the bag, which you can use your ability on to go up to 7. And eventually you'll reveal a star and get rid of Dark Future. It's just not that harsh. It turns your ability off for like 1 to 5 turns, usually like 2 or 3. It very rarely takes 1, 4, or 5. Theoretically, you can just turn your ability off for the rest of the game, but Jacqueline Fine's stat line and the Mystic card pool should be good enough to cover it, even though that does happen. I will point out this makes Jacqueline Fine uniquely poorly equipped to deal with Curse and Bless comps, because it makes it much more likely that Dark Future just kills your ability if the bag is filled with tokens. But even so, it's still not that harsh of a weakness. I don't think Jacqueline Fine makes it to my S tier. I think she's the tippy top of my A+, though. Her ability is absolutely great, Arbiter of Fates is absolutely great, Dark Future isn't that hard. But I mean, realistically, she's offering consistency, not action compression. And while consistency is very highly valued, action compression is better. And I think generally my S tier characters are either offering a lot of action compression by doing things like deduction effects or giving you extra actions, or just drawing a lot of cards and giving you actions indirectly through that. We're doing something completely broken like what Wendy and Gloria do. I don't think what Jacqueline Fine does compares to what Wendy does. She's much worse at making an autofail into a pass than Wendy is, but she can do it for your teammates, so it's a bit of give and take. But her ability is nowhere near the level of Wendy's Amulet in terms of game-breaking power levels. Pretty much every Wendy deck should be built around her Amulet because it's so powerful. I think the very top of A+ is where I would put her. I think in every tier list, anyone who's an A+ should be below Jacqueline. And if in my combined tier list, she isn't at the top of A+, it's only because I'm moving S tier characters down into A+. She's really, really strong. Coming down to Lily Chen, we have a whole lot of disciplines to talk about. And the reason for that is because you're going to start your game with each discipline in your deck face up. You have 1 discipline for every 15 experience you have. You get an additional discipline, but you also get 1 weakness for every discipline in your deck. Her star effect is +2, and you can flip a broken discipline to its unbroken side. The way these disciplines work is they all give +1 to a stat as a permanent asset, and then you can choose to take an action on any of them, which will do something very relevant and powerful, such as the brain ability to heal 3 horror or to image in exchange for taking 1 direct of the other type. But then when you flip it over, you see that after the round ends, if you took no damage or horror, flip this asset to its unbroken side. So all of these, the round you use them, you will be unable to flip them back because using them triggers the effect that causes them to not flip. Your weakness, Burden of Destiny, is super soft, which is good because you probably are going to end up running with 3 to 4 of these in your final deck. First, you can flip a discipline to its broken side. It cannot flip back this round. That's standard. Anytime a discipline flips, you can never flip it back that round. That's true whether you got it from Burden of Destiny or whether you got it from actually using the discipline. Alternatively, if for some reason flipping a discipline right now is not possible, it almost always is, you can just take a damage in a horror. That's really not that bad. With these disciplines, their effects vary tremendously. Generally speaking, the book win probably doesn't make it into your deck because you're not investigating. The plus book is not very valuable. So it's just this draw effect, but this would be like your fourth discipline in any deck. And at that point, you probably have a deck where you have enough cards in hand and the book ability isn't actually helpful very much. So I don't really think this one deserves to be talked about very much, but the other three absolutely do. The foot discipline is, in my opinion, the least important of these three. It lets you one at a time to get to 3 different fight or evade actions, so it's basically a burst damage ability, but giving you +1 in a defensive stat's always useful. And the main reason it's actually relevant is when you flip it, it wasn't important to begin with, and then at the end of the round, if no enemies were at the same location to you, then you flip it back over. That criteria tends to get met passively within like 2 or 3 rounds every time. It's not hard to flip Discipline of Body back over, which makes her weakness softer. Likewise, the Brain Discipline, or the Head Discipline rather, has a very easy condition to flip back over. If you took no damage or horror this round, flip it back over. I'd say on most rounds you don't take damage or horror. It's usually going to flip the next round at the worst on the 3rd round. It's very easy to flip this one, which is very valuable because you actually want to flip this one all the time. If you have spare actions as Lily, you can use them to take 1 direct damage and heal 3 horror, or vice versa. So this is just really strong passive healing, and it's one of the 2 that you're going to need because it's your primary focus. You're either doing proactive things with Fist or with Head. So you might be taking this one first, or you might be taking the Fist one, which will give you +1 Fist, and it has what seems like the worst ability, but potentially the best ability of any of them. As an action, you get +5 skill value for the next test you perform this turn, and this action does not provoke attacks of opportunity. Then you flip it over, and to flip it back, you have to not take a skill test. That's really hard to do. It's going to be offline for a while most of the time. However, this ability usually doesn't need to be used, and when it does, it's a lifesaver. +5 to any test means that you can do some parlay test or scenario-specific test that you have to do to get through the scenario that no one else in your team was really that capable of doing. I'm of the opinion that the order you want to take these is that you want to take the Fist win first, the Head win second, and the Foot win last, and you never want to take the Book win. So you end up with 3 weaknesses. These 2 can be flipped all the time, and you're always keeping your Fist win unflipped unless the scenario demands you flip it. No matter what you do, your first discipline's a little bit awkward. If you take Fist, you're kind of just looking at like Dragon Pole and Enchanted Blade for your weapons, and only having 4 hits can be kind of scary. And if you take the Head one first, then you're a 4-head Mystic with a kind of bad deck. So I'm of the opinion you want to take the Fist one first and play to your really strong outs that way, as opposed to taking the Head one and accepting being a bad Mystic for a couple of scenarios. However, the Head one does eventually help a lot, especially when you build in Cyclopean Hammer, a card which is largely designed for Lily. And I do have to mention it's for Lily. Just like I mentioned before that Harvey was printed with cards like Farsight, Lily was printed with Cyclopean Hammer. It's for her. It just also happens to be for everyone else, which is a slight problem, but that's not the subject of today's video. So now that I've talked about these, I think they're generally very strong. Getting to 5 Fist is crazy. Getting +1 to your offensive stats is crazy. Having burst damage permanently available if you can find the assets to take up different slots for different attacks is very good. Healing is very good. Pushing through any scenario-specific test you need for progress is very good. And her star effect of flipping over a broken discipline usually isn't that relevant, but it is good. It does something. And all she gets other than that is the disciplines, but they're good enough to be worth being an ability. And Burden of Destiny really isn't that big of a problem. Like I've said, there are several disciplines that are not a big deal to flip back over, and if you can't do that, just take one, who cares? Unfortunately, I don't think she gets to be ranked that highly on the tier list. Also, I may have forgotten to grab her character card. I don't think Lily Chen even gets to live in A+ tier. Having access to all of these little abilities and these passive bumps is nice. It does bring her stat pool to a disgusting 4 head, 4 foot, 5 fist, which is just unfair once you have a 30 experience deck. But as I said when reviewing Calvin Wright, if stats is all you're getting, it's not that valuable. It's a bit hard to capitalize on the burst damage from the foot discipline. Most of the time, you don't need her ability for the scenario cards. You can just use Promise of Power for that. You are a Mystic. And the healing one is the best of the 3. but spending an action to heal 2 isn't that incredible. It's definitely the most relevant and the one that makes my evaluation change the most. She's definitely at least making it to A tier because that many stat pumps and relevant stats is crazy. And I think all the little abilities might just get her to the bottom of A+. I think the combined utility value of those little abilities with the softness of her weakness just barely gets her into A+. Next up, we have Dexter Drake. His ability is that as a lightning bolt, during your turn, you can discard an asset you control to play an asset with a different title from your hand, reducing its cost by 1. This lets you capitalize on a lot of cards that would otherwise not be very playable, where the action to play it or the cost of the card is just a little bit too much, and lowering it by this amount really, really helps you out. At the very worst, it lets you replay your Mystic assets once you burn through all their charges. As a star effect, you get +2, you may return an asset from your play area to your hand and then draw a card. This is more helpful when you have limited use charge-based assets that you would like to refill. It's usually not nothing. It is usually going to be relevant, just it's a lot worse than just drawing a card, which is a star effect we have seen several times. Because usually when you hit this, you don't have an asset that you just want to return. Returning the asset is actually a cost most of the time. Dexter is one of those characters with a set of promo abilities and the ones he actually launched with. The promo abilities are much better, so I'll only cover the showmanship set very briefly. It's a talent asset, cost 1. After an asset enters play under your control, you get +2 to any skills while resolving a triggered ability on that asset. That's good, especially for things like Sword Cane. But Dexter's a 5-head mystic and shouldn't be struggling to pass skill tests is the problem. There's also a lot of cards you play that are very important to you where they're going to stay in play for a long time, and this doesn't give you skill tests except for the first turn they were in play. And then Occult Scraps is a kind of gross weakness. It's going to give you -1 head per turn. It's also going to cost you a use of your ability. And if you can't do that, it gives you -2 while it's in your hand, which is brutal. The big reason these aren't worth playing is because with the alternative set, the signature is stronger and the weakness is softer. Molly Maxwell is a 3-cost ally asset with 2 force soak, but you're not going to be using her for that soak. As a lightning bolt, you deal 1 horror to her and exhaust her, you name a trait, and then you draw the top card of your deck with the named trait. It turns out there are a lot of cards in the game that are relatively uniquely traded. Cyclopean Hammer is very likely to be your only relic. David Renfield is very likely, I think actually guaranteed, to be your only patron. And there are several other cards that might be in your deck that are less important, but still relatively uniquely traded. Worst case scenario, she's just going to find a random spell from your deck, which is going to be good. So she's really a 2-1 soak ally. And I think that's completely fine. Just accepting that you don't get the soak and using her ability several times is pretty sick. And if you need the soak, you can just play her for that and let her stick around without doing anything else. Meanwhile, Yastaroth is just not a big deal. He comes into play, you can't put assets into play. That's fine, because for 2 actions, you just get rid of this, and then you play your asset for no actions because you're Dexter. Like, it's just really soft. A lot of the time, you don't even need to play assets and don't have to care about this. So his weakness is soft. His signature is incredibly strong. It's one of the only cards in the game that can tutor a lot of different cards. And I mean, like, it can tutor any card, which is A, unique to it. All the other tutors are pretty much for one type of card. And B, it makes her the only tutor for several different card types, which is a really, really strong effect. And then you look at his ability, it's just generating resources and actions. His star isn't great, but this is pretty sick all told. I don't know if he gets to be an S tier. I think he does. His ability is very close to generate an action every turn. It's not quite there, but considering all the extra resources it's going to make you, it's going to make up for the turns where it misses the value. And it's probably going to be worth at least an action a turn over the course of the campaign. Maybe not at least, but very close to. I think the reason he really gets into S tier, though, was Molly being just such a uniquely powerful card. Signature cards are always worth less than investigator cards because you have to find them. But Molly is so powerful once you do find her. Molly is honestly similar in power level to Analytical Mind. Like, she does something very different, but I think I rank them fairly highly, fairly similarly. Except she is attached to Dexter, who has a much better character card and a much softer weakness than men. And I think that Molly is what is going to get him to the S tier. Next up, we have Luke Robinson, and he begins play with the Gatebox in play. So let's immediately talk about this. It has 3 charges, and as a lightning bolt, you can exhaust it and spend a charge. You disengage from all enemies engaged with you, put the Dream Gate into play, and move to it. The Dream Gate is a 1 shroud and no clue location that's connected to every location in the game, but only Luke Robinson is allowed in his clubhouse. At the end of the investigation phase, you set it aside, out of play, and if Luke Robinson is here, you move him to any revealed location. So first, what is the worst case scenario for Gatebox? It's 3 free move actions per scenario. That is the absolute worst it can ever be, and that's still good. However, a lot of the time, it teleports you across the map and represents much more than that. A lot of the time, it's going to allow you to do really crazy things with not fighting enemies. One of the strongest things Luke Robinson can do is you move him to a location that's in the opposite direction of the rest of your team. A hunter enemy hunts to you, and then there's a free action window there to hop in the gate box, leaving him alone, having walked in the wrong direction. He hasn't hit you, and then you're going to walk out next to your team for an action next round. It's essentially a 2-turn long evade at the cost of an action when you use it like that, but you don't even have to test to do it. There's also all the myriad ways by which you can use the gate box to just teleport across the map and save yourself tons of actions. And realistically, it's not quite elusive, but this is basically 3 free action elusives that cost you no money, start and play, and like elusive is a card that was so good it got banned. And this is better than elusive, because elusive can only take you to revealed locations. Gatebox can take you to a location that hasn't been revealed yet, because you take your turn, your teammates take their turns, then the Gatebox boots you out into a location they revealed during their turn. Gatebox is absolutely insane. It's the best mobility in the game. It's a permanent that you start with on top of that, and it's in Mystics, a class that struggle with mobility. It's absolutely insane, and it's a permanent card that you always have in play. But that's not all Luke gets. He also gets a real ability on top of that. Once per turn, you may play 1 event as if you were at a connecting location and engage with each enemy at that location. This lets you do a lot of things with like Storm of Spirits, Spectral Razor, read the signs that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. There are plenty of events and plenty of targets for them where this is immediately valuable. His star effect is incredible. Gatebox gains a charge. As I've said, the worst case for Gatebox is that it gives you a free move action. So the worst case for his star is that it gives you an action. It's really, really good. All of this so far is incredible, and his weakness sucks, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Dreamgate, if it's already in play, is flipped over. Otherwise, you search your bonded cards for Dreamgate and put it into play, but you use the Pointless Reality side instead. The Pointless Reality side says 6 Shroud, no clues. Again, Luke Robinson only, but this time, it's not your favorite clubhouse. It has the forced effect where instead of leaving at the end of the investigation phase, you do leave, it still boots you out to wherever you want to go, but you're going to take 2 horror on your way out. You can get out of it by successfully investigating the Dreamgate. That is pretty doable a lot of the time, but 6 Shroud with your base book or head of 3 or 4 respectively usually means that you draw Detach from Reality and you skip your turn, especially in the first parts of a campaign. But really, Detached Reality is not that big of a deal, and Dreamgate is absolutely insane. It's pretty much all of what makes Luke, Luke. I'm having a hard time telling myself that Luke doesn't get to be an S tier. Mystics struggle with mobility. Luke's ability, everything about Luke that makes him Luke, is that he gets 3 copies of the mobility card in the game that was so good it got tabooed into another card. And then every time you roll Elder Sign, you get another use of it. Generally, in these analysis videos, I haven't been looking at specific card interactions, but a trend in Mystic is that they suck at mobility, and completely negating that weakness to the point where you're actually the best at it in the game is kind of crazy. I think that if Luke were in another class, if he were like a Seeker primarily, I wouldn't actually value him this highly. But because he's a Mystic and the Mystic card pool struggles with mobility, I think he gets to be an S tier. I could see another class putting him at the top of A+, but honestly, Luke is just a disgustingly strong ability. The reason he might not live in S tier on most tier list is going to be because that he has a really bad starting stat line, but he has a great card pool and a great ability. And I'd say really bad, but he's still a 4-head Mystic, and 4-head as a Mystic is enough to get by. Coming over to our next Mystic, we have Diana Stanley, and she has really fallen from grace in my eyes as I've continually reevaluated characters since I launched that tier list video. She's a gimmick character, you can't ignore her stat line. She starts with 1 head, but every time you use her ability, it's going to go up until she caps out at 6 head. And a quick summary of how I feel about Diana as a character. I used to think she was really strong, that she had the ability to recur abilities like Ward of Protection, and that was super valuable. And that she was being benefited for doing what Mystics already want to do, negating the game. But as I've thought about her more, it's like, actually the correct way to play her is just ward a random card as fast as you can to get your stats going up. And if you don't draw the Twilight Blade, then you don't actually recur anything. So her recursion is very unreliable. And you're not recurring things that were used well the first time. You're just throwing them out to get your head stat higher, which doesn't feel good at all. A lot of the time, Diana's worse at warding cards than other characters, even with Dark Insight as her signature card that she's guaranteed to start with as a 6th card. And the big issue with all of this is that having 6 head isn't a meaningful payoff. A lot of Mystics just have 5 head. You want to know a really easy way to get 6 head that Diana Stanley can't do? Play Pete Sylvester and Agnes. What is blue really giving Diana? Aside from a bunch of bad cards that trigger her ability. And the answer is not a lot. Scaling up to 5 or 6 head isn't actually that important. Plenty of people start with that much. There are plenty of ways to get to that number. It's just not important. And her whole character is that concept, so I'm not a big fan of Diana anymore. I used to think much more highly of her until I realized how she compares to all of the other high head Mystics. Especially Agnes, who gets to 6 head as well, but becomes immune to horror damage by doing it and only has to commit 2 cards in her deck to that purpose. Anyway, having gotten that hot take on Diana out of the way, let's come back to her ability. She has 1 in her head, and she gets +1 head for every card beneath her. After any card you own cancels or ignores a card effect or game effect, if there are fewer than 5 cards beneath Diana Stanley, place that card face down beneath her. Draw 1 card and gain 1 resource, limit once per phase. So your cards are going to cancel game effects, you're going to gain resources and draw cards to replace the cards you just used, and your head's going to go up. That's a pretty strong effect. The problem is that with starting 1 head, it means you're just desperately trying to vomit up cancel cards to become a functional investigator because you are a mystic. Her star effect, though, is absolutely great. You just pick a card under you and add it to your hand. That is, again, an unreliable way of recurring cards from beneath yourself. Her signature is Dark Insight. It's a 2-cost event. You play it when anyone at your location draws an encounter card or weakness. You cancel it. It's gone. Shuffle it back into the deck. Do not draw a new card to replace it. That's not great for player weaknesses in most situations, but it is bad word of protection a lot of the time, so it's quite good. Like, bad word of protection is the bad version of one of the best cards in the game, so Dark Insight's very, very good, and the fact you just start with it in your hand is really good. And you do start with it in your hand. It's mentioned over here under additional setup. You begin each game with Dark Insight as an additional card in your opening hand, and that makes Dark Insight a lot better than it's just a free draw of bad word of protection as well. The 3-cost Twilight Blade is really cool. Hand assets are usually not at a premium in Mystics. And you get the fight ability where you fight with head instead of fist. That helps you with your Mystic problem where you don't tend to have efficient ways to kill Acolytes. But it also lets you play or commit events and skills beneath Diana Stanley as if they were in your hand. As an additional cost to do that, you have to exhaust the Twilight Blade, and you can't trigger her ability when you're doing this, so they're going to go from underneath you to your discard pile, as opposed to your hand or back underneath you. So again, this gives you another way to somewhat unreliably recur the things you're putting under Diana Stanley. And her weakness is Terrible Secret. If there are no cards beneath you, then you shuffle it back into your deck. Otherwise, for every card beneath you, you either discard it or take 1 horror. Cannot be canceled. So this is one of many cards where I have to stop and say, hey, real life gameplay, this card is different. Because Deny Existence doesn't cancel anything. It ignores it, and yes, that is a legally distinct term that does work. The ability would be fairly brutal. If your character is recurring word of protection, you're dealing a lot of horror to yourself. So taking a bunch of horror, like ideally you take 4 or 5 horror from this because you want 4 or 5 cards under you, that's brutal. So usually this means you have to discard the things that you want to recur from underneath you and take a little bit of horror, where you mix and match to your choice based on which cards are underneath you and how much head you think you can get away with. Unless you have Deny Existence, which you are holding specifically for this card, in which case this goes into your discard pile without doing anything, and Deny Existence goes under you and nothing bad happens. So this is a brutal weakness that, because of a specific card existing, usually isn't a big deal. So what do I think about Diana Stanley all told? Her weakness can be a problem, but it's not the worst problem. Twilight Blade is absolutely sick. It's incredible. Dark Insight is absolutely sick. It's incredible. Both of these cards are very, very good. Her ability is drawing a card and gaining a resource to replace the cards you're vomiting out just to get your head higher. And you're also getting your head up from this terrible 1 stat to the best in the game at 6 base. But I can't ignore the deck building constraints that she places on you, where you need to include a whole lot more cancel and ignore effects to reliably get her online than any other Mystic is running, because most of them just run ward and deny existence and nothing else that's nowhere near enough. So you're running a lot of cards that make your deck worse to do this, and this is pretty much just having a higher starter head than any other Mystic. But not at first, you have setup time. So the best thing about Diana Stanley isn't this, it's these 2 cards. It's recursion of cancel effects via Twilight Blade and Dark Insight. But again, your first time through the deck, you're probably just vomiting out those cards to get them under you so you can do your job. So you're recurring Ward of Protection, but the first one you played, you canceled like a Crypt Chill on a 4 or 5 head character who had no valuable assets in play. And you were literally just warding it so that it would be under you. You really aren't fully recurring them. You're getting such bad value the first time you play cards in Diana a lot of the time, that in reality, you aren't recurring cards so much as getting to use them the right way for the first time. These cards are sick, and what Diana's doing isn't bad, but the net effect of this character really does come out to be very close to, you start with Dark Insight in your hand in exchange for a few turns of setup time. And I wish it was better than that, but I really don't feel like it is. I used to think much more highly of Diana. I think I used to think she was a very easy A+ character. And I think right now I'm going to put her in great. And honestly, she's lower on my tier list than this right now. I have her towards the bottom of A-, which I guess the bottom of A in this tier list would be that. Because when you actually look at her decks, she just has so many trash cards that you really don't want. Like, yeah, Dodge is technically a good card, but you really did not want to put it in your deck. And it's a lot better in Diana because it'll replace the resource and replace the card because of her ability. But these cards are just janky, bad cards. Her deck building does not feel good. And every time I look at her, I just imagine putting Pete Sylvester and Agnes, and I'm like, why am I going through the trouble of doing this? She can run Test of Will. She's better at canceling than Diana. What is the point of Diana? And I used to think so highly of her. She's a really interesting character, and she's not bad, but she feels like she should be damn close to S tier. And I honestly have a hard time keeping her in the A tier, and most of that's directly related to her ability. Her card pool and her stat line don't really change that, because her stat line is a part of her ability. She's a gimmick character, and her card pool is basically the card pool that makes the gimmick work, and you have to build your deck according to that for your ability to work, for Diana to work. So no matter what part of her I'm looking at, I'm still putting her in basically the same place, and it's also closely tied together. And right now, that place is A- for me. I wish I could place her higher, but I can't really in good faith do that. Next up, we have Father Mateo. Father Mateo is one of the only characters with a once per game ability. I think he's actually the only one. For some reason, I'm convinced there's a second one, but I can't remember who it would be, so I think I'm going crazy. Anyways, his ability is that as a reaction to an investigator reviewing an autofield token, cancel it and treat it as a star, limit once per game. Coincidentally, Father Mateo's starter effect is absolutely sick. You get to pick. Do you want to draw a card and gain a resource, which is worth more than an action? Or if you're pressed for time, would you like to just take an additional action this turn? Most people have passive recursive effects on their card that are going to help you over and over and over again. So a once per game effect, even though it's a fantastic once per game effect, is not that good. However, it's still very, very good. It's hugely game warping. And specifically, Father Mateo is best friends in the world with Winifred Havemock, because sometimes she has like 4 skills committed to a test and pulls autofail, and she'd really appreciate it if you made that into a star and gave her those skills back instead of failing the test. So like there are a couple things where Father Mateo is really valuable on your team. If you have a fighter using a Sledgehammer 4, for instance, he can just be like, no, you didn't kill me. That didn't happen. You hit him. Trust me. There are a lot of specific interactions where his ability gets a lot better than just being a once per game autofail negation, because what it's negating is disproportionately more value than most autofails are. And his star is absolutely fantastic. And I wonder how much I should talk about Father Mateo's deck building because of things like Alyssa Graham and Blessing of Isis, giving you access to the ability to duplicate your star. Same with you, Catastrophe. And I think, unfortunately, those things are all uniquely locked behind deck building. They don't really fit cleanly within themes. Yeah, I don't feel like Father Mateo's ability to get his Elder Sign off very frequently is something I can talk about without bringing up very specific deck building interactions. which is unfortunate because it's a lot of what makes them arguably better than fine and actually a good investigator. The Codex of Ages is a 2-cost hand asset. It seals the Elder Sign token, so all your teammates hate you, but while it's there, you get +1 to head. The big thing this does, though, is when you would reveal a Chaos token from the Chaos bag, discard this and resolve the Star token instead. Essentially, this is a 2-cost event that says your next action is going to draw the Star token. Considering your father Mateo, you really don't want to stick around with +1 head and the Elder Sign sealed. You want that Elder Sign chance, so you want to use it in that way where you just immediately resolve its effect. But if you're using the Elder Sign immediately, it does one of two things. Either you're using it to push through a test that would have been really hard for anyone on your team to do, and just guaranteeing it with this ability, which is good but not amazing. Or you're banking it like right before an agenda or an act flips and an enemy spawns that you need to have a better chance to kill it. Both of those are fairly niche, but they come up often enough that I think it's still a good card. Not great, but good. The Serpents of Yig are a 2/3/2 enemy. When they spawn, they're going to seal the Elder token on it, and then you're going to have to find a way to deal 3 damage to them, which an early game Mystic might struggle to do, and an early game Fighter might also not appreciate you making them deal with this enemy. It only has 2 fists though, so it should die fairly easily, regardless of whose job it is to kill it. So I think his weakness is relatively soft. I think the Codex of Ages is a really weird card that does not fit cleanly into any playstyle, but it does help you specifically to deal with very, very important problems, whether you're locked out of progress by a Mythos test, or a skill test rather, on a specific scenario card, or you just know a boss is about to spawn and this will help you when it does. It's a good card, not a great card, because its uses are so rare, but still. His once per game effect is good, not great, but it's absolutely broken in specific circumstances where it allows you to play the game differently. That being swinging Sledgehammer without a guarantee that it's not going to kill your teammate, Winifred having just committed 4 skills to every test she plays all game, and being uniquely vulnerable to the Elder Sign, whatever it is, it's going to be really, really helpful in those niche cases. And his star is absolutely one of the best ones in the game. It could have been either of these things that would have still been good, but it's both of them, and you get to pick which one you want more, which is insane. Father Mateo is not better than good, but I also think he is better than fine. I think what holds him out of being good in an actual game is his very awkward deck building, combined with the fact that he's only a 4-head Mystic. His stat line isn't the best, his deck building isn't the best, but his abilities are good. They can be niche in their effectiveness, but they are unambiguously good. Oh, poor Jim Culver, we have to talk about you, don't we? I will preface this by saying that I rank my characters around standard difficulty, taboo list, 2 to 4 player multiplayer, so Skull tends to not be that big of a deal, and it usually just about doubles in penalty value on higher difficulties, which means that Skull is a much bigger deal to turn into a 0 on higher difficulties, but on lower difficulties, I don't care at all. Especially if, as an alternative, I could be playing a 5-head Mystic who's more likely to just bulldoze through whatever the penalty was from the Skull to begin with. Anyways, Jim treats every Skull as a 0, however, it will still trigger all the effects of a Skull. If you reveal a star, you can treat that as a Skull too, which you might choose to do because some events want it to be a Skull, and your star does literally nothing. We're not off to a good start. Thankfully, with Jim's Trumpet, a 2-cost hand asset, and hands are usually uncontested in Mystic, you can exhaust the Trumpet when you reveal a Skull to heal 1 horror from somebody at your location or an ally asset. Okay, so what you're telling me is we don't have an ability, we don't have an Elder Sign, and once we find our unique asset, sometimes once per turn we can heal a horror. That's what we get to do. Alright, this is really bad. This might be the only other investigator that gets to be ranked down in D tier with skids, where like they aren't even fine. This is terrible. It turns out it's not the 4-head and the relatively weak card pool holding Jim down, it's this. Revelation, reveal 5 Chaos tokens in the bag. For every Skull and Squid revealed, or Skull and Autotail rather, take 1 damage and 1 horror. And, God, most of the time it probably doesn't do much. I think it probably averages like hitting you for 1 or 2, like somewhere in the 1.5 region is the average. It's not super harsh. It is subject to variance where it can just kill you. That is always fun. But I think on average, it's not that bad of a weakness. But holy shit, Jim doesn't do anything. Jim actually does nothing. The good part of Jim is his 4-head as a Mystic. I can't put this in C tier. I want to put Jim in C tier, he's going in D. He's the only other investigator that's getting ranked in D tier with skids on the ability list. The tier list gets longer each time I add an investigator to the tier list. So it turns out Skids is so bad he didn't even make it onto the tier list. Let me adjust my OBS a little bit. There, Skids is all the way down here. Sorry about that slight technical issue. But it's appropriate. Jim is so bad that I think I may have just accidentally slipped and called him Skids. But he is so bad that he was briefly not even on the tier list, and that is appropriate. So I said this was all of the Mystics. Evidently, I somehow missed 2 of them. I don't have Marie or Akachi out here. Okay, these are going to be the last 3 Mystics that we need to cover. Let's start with Agnes. Agnes has advanced assets, which we'll talk about in a second. She has a reaction ability to after she takes 1 or more horror, you can deal 1 damage to an enemy at your location, limit once per phase. There are not a whole lot of ways in the game to voluntarily take horror, and generally speaking, they're cards that don't ever make it into any decks. So this is good, but the ways you trigger it with a normal deck are unreliable, and the cards that make it reliable are cards that are not good cards and you don't really want to run. Even in Agnes, they aren't great. They're basically lightning bolt, take a horror, deal damage. But for the cost of playing them, the card slot, the action, it's just that the cards that do this are really bad. If an expansion comes out that prints a card that like you take horror and then do something that's actually really good that you want to put in any Mystic deck, it's going to be a huge buff to Agnes. The star effect is +1 for each horror on Agnes, also known as a blank effect that does nothing. Her signature is a 3-cost accessory item. After you play a spell, draw a card. That's nice, but let's be real, most of the time you don't want to run this, you want to run Holy Rosary, which means this is going to cost you 3 experience, which doesn't feel great for a signature card. But 3 experience for an amulet item that's going to draw you a lot of cards, and Mystic, which you can struggle with draw, is still good. Maybe even the low end of great, honestly, because Mystic card draw does tend to be pretty terrible. Dark Memory is a 2-cost weakness. It's an event. You have to play it and place 1 doom on the current agenda. It's Ancient Evils. Again, cause it to advance. And if you don't want to do that, every time you end your turn with it in your hand, reveal it and take 2 horror. Now, I do have to mention that you can run Pete, even though it's a specific card, because it mitigates the horror you're taking per round by 1. It's still scary. I still hate it. But it's possible to, if you draw this late, just ignore it. And a lot of the time, Ancient Evils isn't going to matter that much. If you play it during the last agenda and your team was already winning with 2 or 3 Doom left, then this just costs you 2 resources a card in an action. Which does suck, but that's not that bad. It's definitely one of the scarier, harsher weaknesses in the game. It's not always easy to mitigate. Sometimes you just play Ancient Evils for 2 resources and a card and progress the agenda early and your team is furious with you. But there's nothing you can do about it. It's just a harsh weakness. It's impressive that it's even somewhat mitigatable. Alternatively, you can take the advanced versions. The weakness costs 2 more to play now. That's actually brutal. You might not even be able to play it if you wanted to. And then her heirloom is gaining the ability to soak 3/3 damage or health, but it's only from player card effects. That does include a bunch of the bad cards that would slowly kill Agnes, steal horror to other people, a bunch of the backfire effects from your signatures, or rather from your Mystic assets, and even potentially the horror from this Dark Memory, which is going to cost you 4 resources, and you can't afford to play it because you're a Mystic and your economy isn't that good. I don't think the advanced stuff is worth running. The fact that this might be legitimately unplayable and just be slowly killing you is a problem. The fact that this gives you Soak, and that's all that changes in exchange for this weakness, you've got access to Pete. You don't need this card. So I'm ranking her based on the original stuff. I think her heirloom is a good card, even a great card because Mystics are so bad at drawing. I think her ability is good. Dealing 1 damage as a fast action is always amazing, even though the cards are making your deck worse and you wouldn't normally run them. Her star does nothing. Her weakness is absolutely terrible, one of the worst in the game. So where does that leave Agnes Baker? A lot of what makes her strong is her stat line and her card pool. She's definitely between good and great. It's a question of where she goes. Top of good, bottom of great. I think her weakness is so harsh, and the cards that deal horror damage as cost to play them are generally so bad that she ends up in just the good tier. She's better than this, for sure, but it's her stat line and her card pool that makes her better than this, not her abilities. Next up, we have Akachi Onele, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. Her ability is that anytime you play an asset with useless charges, give it 1 more. That's really good. It turns out most of what makes Mystic strongs are assets with charges, and getting 25% to 33% more charge on every card you play is really good. Her star effect gives you a charge on one of those assets, which it turns out are the way you play the game, and really, really good. Her ability is a 2-cost slotless asset called Spirit Seeker. You can exhaust it as a lightning bolt to choose an asset you control with useless charges. You either return it to your hand to refresh its charges when you play it out again, or you move all the charges from that asset to your resource pool and discard that asset. That second one is pretty hard to make good use of, but the first one does have some relevance. I'm sure there is some specific interaction with Spirit Speaker and Akachi that's absolutely sick, and I do want to hear about that in the comments, but a specific interaction is irrelevant to how I'm doing this rankings, and from a generic, abstracted, generalist point of view, this says that I can refresh a Rite of Seeking that's run out, which isn't terrible. 2 costs to refresh every spell asset when it runs out of charges is actually really good. But Mystics struggle with economy, and it could be pretty hard to afford to be replaying those assets in addition to another 2-cost asset. It's good. I think her ability is great. It's absolutely incredible. It's not broken, but it's really, really good. And her signature really does not do very much. The Angered Spirit's weakness goes into play in your threat area. As a lightning bolt, you can exhaust a spell asset and move 1 charge from that asset to Angered Spirits. If you end the game without 4 charges on Angered Spirits, then you suffer 1 physical trauma. Of all the cover-up type of weaknesses, I think this is the softest one. Towards the end of the game, you can just exhaust all your spell assets and move them to this twice, and that's easily going to deal with it. I think the only time this is ever a problem is if you draw it late in a scenario, you're the main fighter as Akachi, and then you are like fighting a boss and killing the boss triggers the end of the scenario. That's a point in time where you're probably taking a physical trauma on your 6 health character that really sucks. But I think generally speaking, this is very easy to deal with and not that harsh, specifically for Akachi. So she has a relatively soft weakness, not a particularly powerful or interesting asset, but what she does, despite being super boring, is very, very powerful. I think I put Akachi's ability above Diana's. Just getting more value out of every card you're playing to do your job is pretty damn good. I think it's better than Diana's like sloppy, sort of ineffective method of recursion. And I think it's much better than spending the game setting up to have the same stat line as Akachi. On my tier list right now, I have Akachi lower than Diana. And I constantly look at that and I'm like, man, if I believe what I believe about Diana, shouldn't Akachi be above her? And I'm really afraid that once I play those characters, instead of just having seen other people play them with more limited card pools, that I'm going to have to move Akachi over Diana, because that feels like such a hot take, but in my heart, it feels so right. This brings us to our last character for the Mystics, and in fact, our last character for this series. Regular Impo's ability is that while you have 1 or more Doom among cards you control, you get an extra action that can be used to play spell cards or activate spell action abilities. Of all the abilities that just say, get 1 more action, this is the only one that's not broken. Having to have Doom on your cards is something Mystics can do pretty reliably, but there's a lot that can go wrong, a lot that's very scary about that. It requires meta knowledge. If you're playing this character and you don't know if Ancient Evil's in the deck, then you're playing her wrong. Just flat out, if you as a player are messing with the Doom counter, and you don't know whether or not that Doom counter can suddenly be pushed up without warning you, you've already made a mistake. Before you even made your deck, or done your mulligans, or played any cards, you've already messed up. She requires more meta knowledge to be good than anyone else, because she's terrible without meta knowledge. However, despite that rant, I don't think that's a point against her. I think if I'm making any sort of ranking tier list for characters, then anyone watching this video probably has meta knowledge. I should be ranking them on that, because a power ranking about your first time through a campaign is pointless. I do think that, generally speaking, having Doom on your cards is just hard enough that you can't reliably use this every turn, and you probably only get this on like half your turns. Her star effect is very good. It's not reliable, but it's very good. It can sometimes let you get online without having to spend the card to get the Doom, and it can sometimes let you go 1 more turn with your Doom. Say you have a David Renfield that you're about to sack to keep the turn from advancing, or the agenda rather, and you hit your Elder Sign, and you were about to play something like Sacrifice to kill him, you can be like, oh, I can remove 1 Doom from it, we go 1 under the Doom clock by doing that, and then I can use him again, and not have to set up my Doom again just yet. So the Elder Sign, despite not doing anything a lot of the time, does a whole lot of work some of the time. It's not great, but it isn't terrible. Her Mystifying Song is absolutely sick. It's one of the better signature cards in the game. It's a 3-cost event. You play it when the agenda would advance by reaching its Doom threshold, and until the end of the phase, the agenda cannot advance by reaching its Doom threshold. Remove it from the game. That's really good. The best use of warrior protection is very frequently to stop ancient evils. There are better uses for it than that, but very frequently you just use it to stop ancient evils. And this can actually stop like multiple copies of ancient evils. And by multiple copies of ancient evils, I don't mean specifically ancient evils. I mean Marie has done something that would push the clock over, but she keeps it from being a problem by playing Mystifying Song. And more likely, something bad happening with acolytes or doom on locations that would cause the turn to advance sooner, and you just get an extra turn out of the Mystifying Song, and Marie gets to not worry about doom for that turn as well. It's not crazy broken, because rereading this, I don't think it works on ancient evils. If it does work like that, please correct me, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Ancient evils places a doom, and its effect may cause the agenda to advance. So even though the agenda is reaching the doom threshold, it's being advanced by ancient evils not reaching the doom threshold, right? That's really unclear to me. Anyway, assuming it can't work on ancient evils, my opinion on it isn't quite as high, but still a very good card. Rare Insanity is one of the scariest weaknesses in the game. First of all, he takes up an ally slot. No one else does, that's just mean. He shows up and suddenly your best friend David Renfield has died. What's worse is he won't leave play until you put 3 doom on him, which can be a little bit hard to do. A lot of the time, he shows up during a 5 doom agenda, and it's like, oh, cool. So if I put doom on you, you're going to advance the agenda 2 turns early before I get rid of you. All right, cool, you get to hang out then. And while he's hanging out, everyone at your location takes an additional damage anytime they take damage. So yeah, Rare Insanity is almost always inconvenient. Sometimes he kills a valuable ally asset. Most of the time, he doesn't deal too much damage to you, but he'll probably deal a little bit. And how long he's around threatening you with that effect is highly variable based on when you draw him and what the agendas we're talking about are. He's definitely harsh. Very few weaknesses just flat out kill an ally asset. But he's not that harsh, and you build your deck around him. By which I mean you don't include 3 high priority ally assets, you do include the 2nd charisma. So if he does show up, worst case he's killing an arcane initiate, who cares? So what do I think about Marie all told? Kind of a rough weakness, not the worst in the game. A really strong ability. This is very nearly just if Marie's in the game, you get 1 to 2 extra turns. And she gets some free actions. Not a crazy number, but a good number of free actions. We're looking at somewhere between low A and low B. I'm not quite sure where just yet. Free actions are really good. You don't get them all the time. What you're doing to get them is pretty inherently risky. But generally speaking, despite that, with proper play, Marie is not going to cost you any additional turns. Instead, Marie's going to give you an additional turn because of Mystifying Song. Maybe multiple additional turns, depending on like your luck with draws of like Acolyte or Mysterious Chanting. Her weakness is rough, but not that rough. I think she gets to be an A. Just getting a free action, even if it's only like half your turns, is really good. I do think her ability is worse than Diana's, though. Which means that this is our final tier list for the Mystics. It hurts me to do that to Gem. Because I don't even think Gem's a bad investigator, but that's because just being a Mystic is good. And just having 5 splash lets you take some broken Seeker cards to cover your weaknesses. In his case, give him more head and draw more cards. Fine implies that his abilities do anything. And honestly, I'd rather draw a different card than the Trumpet. Like, I'd rather not have the Trumpet in my deck. If I wanted to be the team's healer, I would run better healing cards than the Trumpet. It makes me so sad that Gem's like, if I get my signature asset, I can sometimes heal 1 horror. I could have sworn that it was like 2 horror or 1 horror and draw a card. I don't know why Gem just doesn't do anything. I think I might have been being a little bit nice to some of the Mystics. I could see like the tier list being with Lily Chen moved down, Marie moved down, and Father Mateo moved down. I think there's an argument that all of those characters don't quite deserve to be as highly as I placed them. But I do think I'm personally of the opinion they are where they should be. Marie's still getting enough extra actions to be great. Lily Chen's stat bumps and little utility abilities add up to a very powerful whole. And Father Mateo is just... he's more than fine. Turning an autofail into a star is just really, really good. And even though, like, Elder Signs aren't super reliable and his ability is very niche, the Codex of Aegis, his weakness is also quite soft, and I think he's just, like, by the skin of his teeth, a good character. At least from the ability side of things. I think this is probably like the most well-spread tier list we have of any of the classes. Its S tier has 3 very different kinds of strong. Luke negating the weakness of his class, Dexter Drake just having a very powerful throughput ability and signature asset, Gloria just completely turns off the game and could be like on a higher tier way above them. Our A+ tier is 2 very different characters that get to different ends of A+ through very different means. Our A tier is, again, 3 very different characters getting to A tier through very different means. And B, everyone's different, everyone's at different ends of the spectrum through different means. I feel like this has the most even spread of power levels of any of the tier lists we've done so far, and the most diverse ways of getting to them. Which is interesting, like going through this, there was no trends with their abilities, right? Mystic deck building feels so problematic. I made a video about the Mystic mono deck. But when you look at their abilities are diverse in power and effect. It's just you sit down to make the deck and you're like, anyway, so I put in the Mystic assets, the plus had skills, and several very strong events that go in every Mystic deck, and whoops, I'm already at 22 cards. But yeah, I actually really like how diverse Mystics are from an ability perspective. And as with most classes, I think the same thing happens with Mystic. Their abilities are generally not holding them down. Jim's is. Jim's ability is holding him down. Aside from that, no one is being held down by their ability. Generally speaking, character abilities and signature cards are all upside. They only elevate a character, they never hold them down. And this tier list is a good example of that. Every single one of these characters is either in the same place or a higher place than they would be on my normal tier list, except for Jim. Sorry, Jim, you just forgot to have abilities. I really thought you did something on normal difficulty, but it turns out you don't. Which is very unfortunate. It also makes me really look forward to playing Jim, though, since he is basically monocolor Mystic with 4 head and no ability. It means that when I play Jim, I get a really good feel for the baseline of what a Mystic can do. Sometime soon, I'll probably be aggregating all 5 of these tier lists into an ability tier list, but I will talk about it once I go through it and talk about the trends I've noticed compared to my current tier list. Anyways, that's it for now. I've been rather incoherent. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then consider liking and subscribing. That stuff really helps the channel grow. And I'll see you in the next one.